computer. Okay, let me just make sure that this is working. Yes, okay, fantastic. All right, and I'll jump right in. We always like to start with this statement of solidarity. So the Canadian Network of Community Land Trust works on the traditional territories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across so-called Canada. We acknowledge that we're engaging in land-based practices on stolen lands, and we're committed to supporting Indigenous sovereignty and well-being through tangible actions. So for the network, this includes supporting the development and growth of Indigenous-led CLTs. We have the logos of a few of them in the bottom right corner there. It also includes documenting best practices for supporting reconciliation, decolonization, and land back through CLTs. We have some research on this topic that's ongoing, and developing resources to support non-Indigenous CLTs in solidarity efforts. So this is something that we want to kind of mention every time to keep ourselves accountable to incorporating this into all of our work. And I also want to add that I'm calling in from Tkaronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And feel free to add an acknowledgement of the land you're currently on in the chat if you'd like. So since you're here, I know you know a bit about CLT, but we have some new faces today, so it's always worth repeating. So basically our mission is to support the CLT sector across Canada to grow, which means supporting CLTs in acquiring, developing, and stewarding land to use for community benefit. So we do that, through knowledge mobilization like this webinar. We also do it through technical assistance, so providing tailored support to CLTs on all the topics covered in this and other webinars. And finally, we build the CLT movement and raise its profile through things like the CLT Summit that we did for the first time this past October and that we'll be doing again, and through regular network meetings and working groups and other opportunities for CLTs to come together and share and support each other. And if you're not already a member, you can join the network either as a CLT member if you're with a CLT or as an associate member if you're not. You can find more information on that on our website. And you can learn a lot more about us and the things that we do, again, on our website, or you can feel free to send me an email, set up a chat with me anytime. So classic housekeeping, everybody knows. Stay muted just when you're not talking. You can put questions in the chat at any time or raise your hand. I'll try to address them either as I go or at the end. You can have your camera on or off. I know this is over dinner time for a lot of you, so I'm not offended. But also, even if you're eating, you can keep it on. It's up to you. And I will send the slides and with all the links to a number of other resources tomorrow. So if you didn't register and you somehow got the link for this anyway, please do maybe send me an email just to let me know, because otherwise I don't have your email to send you the slides. I think that's it on housekeeping. And again, yeah, this is being recorded, but we will be editing out kind of the audience participation pieces before we publish the recording. So just to let you know, and I'll send you a feedback form as well tomorrow. Please do fill it out as it really helps us know what's working and what else we can do. And I also want to know what you'd like to see in future webinars, as we have some other ones on exciting topics coming up. So what are we doing this evening? So the purpose of this webinar is to give you a background on what charitable status is and how it relates to CLTs, so that you can make informed decisions about whether or not your CLT will apply for charitable status, and if you do, how you'll go about it. So I'm going to start by positioning this topic within our broader CLT roadmap. Then I'll get into the basics of charitable status and provide some examples of CLTs with charitable status. Benjamin will then present on charitable status and housing and get into some of that nitty-gritty, as well as talk about the types of non-charitable activities that charities can do. Then I'll conclude with some alternative approaches and thoughts on charitable status. At the end, we should have plenty of time for questions and some discussion as well. We'll probably power through without a break today, but do feel free to get up and stretch whenever you need. All right, so our trusty old roadmap, again, if you've been to these webinars before, this will be a bit of repetition, but we're working on creating resources for CLTs based on what we call the CLT roadmap. This is essentially a way of mapping out the different steps and decisions that CLTs will generally go through from before they incorporate all the way to stewarding land and beyond. I want to make it really clear that this roadmap is not intended to be prescriptive. The order of events will vary a lot based on your particular circumstances, but it's intended to help support CLTs through all the kind of steps and decisions and challenges that they tend to encounter. So we're essentially building a library of resources and best practices and tips for CLTs. And it's very much a work in progress, so we're always keen to hear ideas and suggestions on resources we can create. This webinar covers one component of phase 2, as you can see here, on charitable status. If you were at the phase 1 webinars way back, we covered developing guiding principles, community organizing, conducting community research, business planning. And so far in phase 2, we've covered governance structures and incorporation bylaws. And coming up soon, we'll be developing webinars and resources around the theme of building internal capacity, and that'll include strategic planning, recruiting and engaging your membership and board, and hiring staff. So stay tuned for more on that. Very important disclaimer, this webinar is not legal advice. It's not specific to your situation, and it is just general legal information. Also, I am not a lawyer, unlike Benjamin. So before I get into kind of the specifics of charities, I want to start by clarifying something that most of you already know, which is that a community land trust is not a specific legal structure. CLTs in Canada are basically always nonprofits. And as nonprofits, they have a number of options when it comes to incorporating, which can vary based on their province or territory of operation. But sometimes people use charity and nonprofit interchangeably. And it's important to note that while, like I said, basically all CLTs I can think of in Canada are incorporated nonprofits, only some are registered charities. So what is a registered charity in the Canadian context? And this is coming straight from the Canada Revenue Agency, which is the body that regulates charities. So they are charitable organizations, public foundations or private foundations, created and resident in Canada, of course. They must use their resources for charitable activities and have charitable purposes that fall into one or more of the following categories. And they list them here, and Ben will talk more about these later. So while these categories like the relief of poverty and other purposes that benefit the community might sound quite broad, you can see that this is a more kind of narrow definition than the definition of a nonprofit. This definition is based not just on how kind of money flows in and out of the organization, but also on what exactly the organization is doing and who they're serving. So again, in Canada, charitable status is a legal concept that's relevant primarily to the application of the Income Tax Act, although it has other implications as well. Charitable status and registration and enforcement, like I said, is managed by the CRA. And registered charities are a form of qualified donee, which means that they can issue official donation receipts for gifts that they receive from individuals or other corporations. And they can also receive gifts from other registered charities. I wanted to bring up this reference that the CRA makes to CLTs in their guidance on community economic development and charitable status, because it's one of the rare occasions where the government sort of defines and acknowledges CLTs. I'm not going to read the whole definition, but I think it's useful to note that they say that operating a CLT may be a charitable activity if it directly furthers one or more of the charitable purposes that they list. So they're kind of recognizing that it is possible for CLTs, as they're normally defined, to be a charity if they so choose. So when it comes to applying for charitable status, it involves providing quite a lot of detailed information to the CRA. What exactly you need to provide will depend in part on your particular circumstances, but likely it'll include your incorporating documents, details on your charitable activities, which again, Ben will speak to more later, any income earning activities that you do, a bunch of financial information on your organization, and any partnership agreements that you have. And the CRA does have a kind of handy application checklist generator that you can use to figure out which of these will apply to your CLT if you choose to apply. So the process is more or less straightforward, but it can be quite lengthy. And the length is both because of the CRA's processing times, which can be long, and also because they'll often come back to you requesting further information. So the first step is you submit your application online. If it's deemed complete, they'll send you an acknowledgement letter with an estimated processing time, but if it's incomplete, it'll be sent back to you and you need to start again. If your application is rejected outright in the first place, you'll have 90 days to submit an appeal, or you could just resubmit, so kind of start from scratch. If the CRA decides that they need more information than what you've provided in your application, they'll send a letter detailing what they need more information on, and then you have 60 days to respond. And from there, again, you'll either be approved or you'll be rejected, in which case, again, you have 90 days to appeal. And if you do appeal once and you're rejected again, you can appeal to the Federal Court of Appeals. So I want to provide kind of a high level pros and cons or benefits and constraints of having charitable status. But again, this is going to vary based on your organization and your priorities. So generally, benefits include, of course, being able to issue tax receipts for donations. This can help incentivize donations, including donations of land to your CLT. Also, as a charity, you're eligible for additional grant opportunities. So a number of foundations, as I'm sure a lot of you have come across, will specifically only provide grants to charities. So you might be restricted in which grants you can apply for if you're not a charity. Charities can also benefit from increased public trust, and they can be exempt from some taxes or fees. So for example, in BC, charities are exempt from the property transfer tax, although that's not the case in Ontario. Some constraints, the application process can be costly and in some cases lengthy. You will have increased reporting and financial management requirements imposed on your organization, which can require greater staff or volunteer capacity. As you know, I think we all know, charities are limited in the political activity that they can do. It doesn't mean that you can't do any kind of advocacy, but there are limitations that you want to be wary of if you're a charity. There are also limitations on the forms of housing that you can provide, and specifically the operating models that can be used. And again, Ben will speak to this in more detail. Also, your charitable status can't be easily reversed. So assets are effectively locked into your charity. If your charitable status is revoked, either voluntarily you choose to give it up or involuntarily, you'll need to transfer all your assets to another qualified donee, or you pay a certain tax, which basically means paying for all the assets that your charity has. So you're kind of stuck in that model to an extent once you choose charitable status and start gaining assets as a charity. So there are currently 4 active CLTs in Canada that have charitable status, and I'm going to briefly talk about each one and share what they've told me about that decision. It's interesting to note that 2 of them are single organization structures, so that means that that CLT is only comprised of the one organization, that's a charity, but 2 of these CLTs have a charity as part of a multi-organization structure. So first, we have Gabriola Island Land Steward Society, which is in BC, on Gabriola Island. They chose to pursue charitable status to encourage donations to their society. And specifically, they see bequests of land in wills as a potentially important source of land for them. So they really want to be able to encourage that. Their charitable purpose falls under the category of relief poverty. And they found the process a bit onerous. They were describing their challenges to me. They found the online application quite confusing, which I think a lot of people would have the same issues. They found that some documents were originally missing, but there was quite a delay in learning that their application was incomplete, which sort of delayed their process. They were asked for further information once they'd submitted their application. And what they did was they called the CRA. They did originally, they told me they got an agent that wasn't particularly helpful, but then they called back and got someone who was very helpful and told them, in detail exactly what kind of information they would need to resubmit. So they shared this tip, which I think is a good one in a lot of circumstances probably. But if you call and you get an unhelpful agent, maybe try calling back, because they are able, if they're willing to provide quite a lot of detail on what they're looking for from you and what you can do to make your organization kind of compliant. And so they ended up submitting a 10-page letter in response, addressing all of the CRA's concerns, and then they were approved. They're still in quite an early stage. They just incorporated a few years ago, so they haven't really had any challenges with the restrictions that come with charitable status yet. So for them so far it's been positive, but we'll see if there are any kind of restrictions that they come across as time goes on. A similar example, also in BC on a beautiful island, Denman Community Land Trust Association. They incorporated a while back and received charitable status in 2009. They have one unit on one property currently. It's kind of a hybrid affordable housing unit. And they've also been working on a senior housing development as well. They've said that donations are a really important source of funding for them. And they find that having charitable status really gives them credibility with donors, as well as enabling them to provide donation receipts. Both pieces of land, one that they own and one that I think is still in progress, are donated, one by an individual and one by a company. And they found that being a charity has really helped facilitate those donations. They did specify that for them, charitable status hasn't been very restrictive in their activities, in part because of their particular circumstances, they haven't felt the need to engage in a lot of political advocacy in order to get their kind of key supporters and stakeholders on board. So that hasn't been a kind of important restriction for them. And they are volunteer run, but they've said that they find their reporting requirements quite easy to meet. So now to get into the organizations, CLTs that have a charity as part of their organizational form, but have multiple organizations. So I said a couple webinars ago that I was going to try to talk less about Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, but people really ask about them all the time, and Sandy's laughing, and specifically ask about this, because a lot of people look at their organizational structure and think, well, this is kind of the best of both worlds. They really solve this issue of kind of what's restrictive about charities, but also what's beneficial. But I think it's really important to kind of understand the specific context in which this structure made sense for them. So essentially, they originally incorporated a nonprofit that was legally called the Neighborhood Land Trust, but was informally referred to as Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. And then they found that they really wanted to have charitable status to enable them to solicit donations, and also to enable them to get grants from specific foundations. This was particularly because at that time that they were being formed, in like 2015 to 2017, there weren't a lot of funding opportunities for CLTs specifically. And so they found that, to access those few grants that they could, that could kind of apply to their work, they needed to be a charity. So they incorporated a second nonprofit, which was called Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, and they applied for charitable status for the Neighborhood Land Trust, NLT. So they have PNLT, which is not a charity, which has an open membership and an elected tripartite board. PNLT is the sole member of NLT, the charity, and therefore appoints the charity's board. NLT is the actual owner of all the land that the CLT owns, and they have a closed membership and, again, a small appointed board. PNLT can do some of the things that NLT can't as a charity, like community planning work, like specific kinds of advocacy. And in the future, they do think that it could make sense for some of their property to be owned by PNLT instead, but that is kind of to be determined depending on what opportunities come up. Some more detail on this, because it was quite a kind of complex process for them. It took them over a year to apply for and receive charitable status. At this point, the CRA was not overly familiar with the CLT model, so there was a lot of back and forth. They did receive pushback on a number of things originally. So that included community planning, which is, a key part of the work of a lot of CLTs, but which is not considered a charitable activity, or the CRA at that point said it was not. They also received some pushback on research and education. So kind of research, specifically community engaged research, and community education are two kind of key activities for PNLT. But CRA specified that for it to be a charitable activity, it would need to be conducted by experts, and had a lot of kind of specific restrictions around who needed to conduct the research, and the research had to be specifically around their other charitable activities. They also had some back and forth on the issue of the leasing of properties. Now, I should specify that this isn't kind of set in stone rules from the CRA, but when you apply for charitable status, you're kind of each situation is unique, so there's going to be some kind of negotiation and back and forth potentially. So what they ended up agreeing to with the CRA is that they would have to lease only to other charities. So land that the NLT owns cannot be leased to any organization that does not have charitable status. And also all revenue from that's not from their affordable housing would need to be reinvested in their charitable activities. So some things that they have found kind of notable about this, the housing that they operate as a part of their charitable activities needs to be income tested, which again, Ben will speak to more. They found that some non-housing land uses will be restricted or might be a bit complicated, but community economic development spaces can be considered charitable. So for them, that includes a community garden that they own. Their two organization structure does require significant community involvement to maintain it. So they need to have enough people who are really engaged and really care about what they do and are willing to volunteer their time to fill both boards. The NLT, the charity board, is smaller. I think it's 4 people possibly, but still that's additional volunteers that you need to have. You need to replace regularly, and that won't be possible in all communities. They also find that significant financial management is required as a charity, but also specifically running 2 organizations, there's additional complications. And bookkeeping for these kinds of organizations is often more complicated than organizations expect it to be. They also said that it's helpful to have your charitable objects already formed when you first incorporate, if possible, if you are planning on applying for charitable status, because those will need to line up, but it's always possible to update them at a later point. And the last example I'll speak about is CLT BC. So this is quite a complex organizational structure. Community Land Trust of British Columbia is an organization that was formed by the Co-op Housing Federation of BC. And as part of this multi-organizational structure, they have a charity, which is called the Community Housing Land Trust Foundation. This charity, they use primarily for acquisition projects because, again, in BC, charities are exempt from the provincial land transfer tax. And for them, they find that the cost savings from being exempt from that tax are massive and can, in some cases, enable them to either make a project financially feasible or enable them to charge lower rents than they would otherwise be able to. They do find that the charity is restrictive in terms of what housing can be operated. So for them, that means they're only able to provide housing to those at shelter or rental assistance income rates. Whereas sometimes, and there are ways of going about this that, again, Benjamin will speak to, but some nonprofit housing developments, you might want to have a mix of income levels, of rent levels within a property. You could operate a property at market rent and then put revenue into a kind of security of tenure fund that would subsidize rent for income tested households. That's something that they've figured out and that they do. And another thing that they noted is that, the general legal advice they've received is that the charity should ideally not directly operate their properties, at least in a kind of land trust situation like this. So, they need to, like NLT does, lease to a charity or have some kind of other arm's length organization that is doing the kind of property management and operations. So I'm pass it off to Benjamin Miller to talk in more detail about charitable status and housing. You can just kind of give me a nod or tell me next slide when you want me to move along.
Sounds good. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you about charitable status and housing. And I'll just begin by noting that we've already heard about a number of other charitable purposes that might be relevant to a land trust, such as education. And so my comments are going to be restricted to housing, but I'm happy to take questions if those other charitable purposes are relevant to you, about legal considerations in pursuing those other charitable purposes. I note in particular, for example, Celia mentioned at the beginning on the question of land trust and land back, the benefit of Aboriginal peoples is actually a charitable purpose on its own. And so there's lots of interesting potential to explore there. But we're talking about how charities can engage in housing. Next slide. So what makes a purpose charitable? We've already heard a bit of information on this, but I'm going to expand a bit. So registered charities must have exclusively charitable purposes and activities. And usually where organizations like land trusts stumble is in that word exclusively, meaning chances are if you're doing good work in the community, at least some of your purposes or some of your activities are going to be considered charitable. But it's not good enough for just some of it to be considered charitable. An entity to be considered charitable needs to be exclusively charitable. So it's that artificial segmentation or segregation of the charitable stuff that poses problems often to land trusts applying for charitable status. So what falls into this category of charitable purposes, charitable activities? So a charitable purpose needs to deliver a benefit to the public or a sufficient segment of the public. Okay, that's pretty intuitive. We want public benefit. Furthermore, it cannot deliver an unacceptable private benefit. And this is where we start running into tension between the kind of mutual benefit ethos or philosophy of the land trust, that it's people helping out each other, often the people who actually live in the land trust, and the idea of charity, which is this idea of a kind of altruistic benefiting of the others. So depending on the governance structure, that trying to cement that mutual benefit philosophy can look like unacceptable private benefit from the charity law perspective sometimes. So you need to deliver sufficient public benefit. You can't deliver unacceptable private benefit. And I'll note that it needs to be sufficient public benefit in a way the law regards as charitable. So not everything that we might agree is good will necessarily count as a charitable purpose for legal purposes. The most obvious example of this is, I'm sure if you polled, 95% of CRA agents, is providing affordable housing, a benefit to the public, they'd probably say yes. Does that make it charitable? No. So that's the key thing. Affordable housing is not in and of itself a charitable purpose. It becomes a charitable purpose when you can fit that affordable housing, or if you like, that affordable space providing within one of the four categories Celia already mentioned. Relief of poverty, that's the most common one. You're providing affordable housing to those who are currently in poverty. Advancement of education, we'll talk about this. This is like providing housing to students, as is done in residences. Advancement of religion. So, for example, you might provide housing to nuns or clergy associated with some kind of religious order. Or number four, other purposes beneficial to the community in a way the law regards as charitable. And this is where a lot of the community economic development stuff happens. So, bottom line, affordable housing isn't in and of itself charitable, but if you can provide affordable housing in a way that fits within one of these four purposes, and that is, both your purposes and your activities exclusively fit within this charitable mold, then your organization may qualify as charitable. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about relief of poverty because that's the most common situation. The first thing I'm going to note about allowing something to fit within the purpose of relief of poverty is that it is relief of poverty and not prevention of poverty. So it's perhaps trite to observe that if we provided people with affordable housing, it would be less likely that they would fall into poverty, that they would end up in poverty. So a great strategy in preventing poverty from happening in the first place is just providing affordable housing in the first place. Unfortunately, preventing poverty is not the charitable thing. A person has to already be considered in poverty for then a charity to be able to step in and help them with charitable services and goods. So, how does CRA think about people in poverty? So I'm quoting the bottom of the slide. Quote, people experiencing poverty are those who do not have the ability to acquire the basic necessities of life or simple amenities that are seen as necessary for a modest but adequate standard of living. The key thing I want to point out in this definition that the CRA provides is that it's not a number. It's not a formula, right? It's not a precise scientific calculation. It's actually pretty general and it's pretty flexible depending on the circumstances your particular community is in. And this is where the opportunity for creativity lies to make the meaning of charity work for your particular circumstances. As Celia already shared in the examples of land trusts that have obtained charitable status, it needed to be income tested. But what that income is an opportunity for negotiation with the CRA. If you can justify your definition of poverty, for example, with reference to LICO or a market basket measurement or some other kind of measurement that you can justify in terms of economics literature, for example, then there is room there to expand who might qualify as an eligible candidate for your services. Now, this doesn't solve the whole problem, but what it does is it gives you the opportunity to improve your margins of who you might be able to bring in and what rent they might be able to afford. And as we all know, making projects works depends to a great extent on the margins. So creativity there matters. One thing to note, so getting back to this idea that what's charitable is providing public benefit and not providing unacceptable private benefit. What that means is that even if somebody is in poverty, meaning they are a potentially eligible beneficiary, you still cannot provide more benefit to them than would be justified by your charitable purpose. The greater and more frequent the benefit you are providing to a person is, the more demanding CRA is going to be about the criteria you are using to determine whether somebody meets it or not. So an example of this would be let's say you've got a community garden and the produce from the garden you give out to people who are facing food insecurity, and you're not so careful to ask for everybody's tax return before you give them some lettuce, right, or some carrots. Well, you know what, that's probably fine, right? Caveat, I can't provide legal advice in this situation, but generally speaking, probably fine. You could give them some carrots. But if you're giving them month after month a rent subsidy of $500, $1,000, something like that, it will become important. The CRA will want to see that you've actually received some documentation to demonstrate that individual does qualify for the benefits you're providing. So this is not a yes or no question. The extent of documentation and how rigorous you need to be exists on a spectrum based on the extent of the benefit you are providing. One thing I will note is that it's important in many contexts, especially if you're working with individuals who face systemic barriers in obtaining housing. Chances are there will be other supports that they may need in order to remain in stable housing. And you can provide these other necessities or associated amenities. It doesn't have to be just housing. And so that's where relief of poverty may interact with other charitable purposes. Such as promotion of health, for example, in the instance of working with people who may face substance use issues and so on. So what's an example of an acceptable, likely to be acceptable charitable purpose? Quote, to relieve poverty by providing residential accommodation at below market rate and by providing support and incidental facilities to individuals or families who are in need. And those incidental facilities may be things like childcare, for example, maybe things like support groups, etc. And so you have an opportunity to be more holistic in what actually happens on the land in this way. But you need to be able to explain why you're doing all these activities in relation to your charitable purpose, which in this case is providing that housing. Next slide. So the definition that Celia provided earlier in the Community Economic Development Guidance pointed out that providing housing might be charitable if either A, the person is in poverty, or B, they have a disability. What I would add is if they are aged, if they are advanced in years, then providing accommodations which are especially adapted to them may also be charitable, even if those individuals are not considered to be in poverty. The definition that the CRA uses here is, quote, providing comfortable, modest housing, which can include specially adapted facilities, services, or other amenities. And a special note, though, if the organization provides life tenancies for seniors, this in and of itself will not be regarded as charitable. So you're going to need additional justification if you are, a community, let's say, for example, retirement residence that operates based on the idea of life tenancies. And you might just justify this based on the idea that you are serving seniors who face some other kind of systemic barrier to housing. That might fall under the category of promotion of racial equality. It might be promotion of health. There are other charitable purposes you could look to justify the specific community of seniors that you're providing housing to. Next slide. So far we've gone through the charitable activities that an organization might be able to engage in as it relates to housing. But charities can also provide housing that in and of itself is not charitable, but may be justified if it falls under the categories of either related business or investment. And so this is where we get into the extent to which a land trust may be able to operate space at market rents, whether it's residential spaces or whether it's leasing out to local businesses or something like that. If an organization wants to operate at market rents, typically it's going to have to justify what it's doing in terms of related business or investment. So I'm now going to explain what those terms actually mean. So housing can be done as what's called a related business, and there is a specific guide which is linked at the bottom of the slide called What is a Related Business? So you can learn more about what it takes to qualify something as a related business. But the bottom line is, in order for a as a related business, that business needs to be linked and subordinate to the charitable purposes and activities of the organization. So what does it take for a business to be considered linked to charitable purposes and activities? So one way it could be linked is if it's a usual and necessary concomitant of a charitable program, right? I love that word, concomitant. What an example of a usual and necessary concomitant activity would be something like a student residence. So if you operate a school, well, and the students need a place to live, so operating the residence, it just kind of flows naturally from what you need to do in order to provide your ultimate charitable purpose, which is not actually to provide housing, but is to provide education. So there's opportunity for creativity if you, for example, operate a, radical school of some kind or another, where are the students going to live in order to be able to participate in the school. So you may be able to operate student residences, and the students don't need to be in poverty. So there's more flexibility in terms of who can live there, but it does have to be done in a bona fide way, in a real way, in support of that other educational purpose. If you are, secretly just doing the educational purpose in order to support this housing, then if that can be objectively proven by, your internal conversations and documents about you and so on and so forth, then CRA will notice that and will say, actually, this isn't linked. This is secretly your real purpose. So be careful. Another way, number two, B, that a business can be linked to a charitable purpose or activity is if it is an offshoot of a charitable program. So an example of this that we've already talked about is the land trust operates a community garden. If it wants to not give away that food, but actually sell that food to local restaurants as a way to generate income for the land trust, then if the community garden was charitable in the first place, then the fact that you now have all these vegetables, well, that's legitimate. It was charitable all the way until now, so you can then earn some return on these charitable benefits that these products that you've generated. Another classic example of this is, let's say you operate a shelter for youth, and one of the things you do in terms of your wraparound services for your youth is building employment skills for them, or fostering arts or crafts as a therapeutic method, something like that. Well, at the end of the day, they may have created jewelry, they may have created wood crafts, they may have created something which you can then turn around and sell. Selling that may be considered a linked business and therefore could be a related business. So this is another way that a land trust could potentially generate revenue to subsidize its operations. C, if it is a use of excess capacity. So a classic example of this would be you've got a big old church, and the church is only occupied once a week and occasionally on holidays, and the rest of the time it's basically empty. So during those periods of time, it might be rented out as an event hall. That's something that's very commonly done. Now, just putting on random events is not in and of itself charitable, but because you are making use of excess capacity, and that excess capacity can be justified in terms of your charitable purpose, then you're allowed to actually to get quite creative in how you use that excess capacity. The key thing here is you need to be able to justify why you have this excess capacity in terms of your charitable purpose. So it's fairly obvious in the case of a religious building. They need the building for their services, but their services aren't necessarily all the time. So that explains why they have the excess capacity. But if, for example, you build or you acquire $100 million building, right? But you only really have charitable plans for the $1 million worth of the space, and then your plan is we're going to use the other $99 million of excess capacity to run things at a market rate. CRA is going to look at that and say it's not really justified. That excess capacity is not explainable in terms of your charitable purpose. All right. So in the context of a land trust, if you've been gifted a building and it's a bigger building than you immediately know what to do with, you can tell a story to CRA about why you have this building in the first place, why it makes sense for your charitable purpose, and why in the meantime you don't really have a charitable use for all that space. So you can go and do other things with it that might be done at market rate. The fourth way that a related business might be linked is the sale of items that promote the charity or its objects. Classic example of this, branded T-shirts, or if people remember those wristbands that were popular, about a decade ago, things like that. So you can get super creative in terms of what you brand. Secondly, subordinate. So it's not enough for a thing just to be linked. It has to both be linked and subordinate in order for it to qualify as a related business. So in the first case, I gave 4 ways that something might be linked. When we talk about subordinate, you need to be able to check off each of these boxes in order for something to be considered subordinate. So what counts as a related business that is subordinate to the charitable purposes and activities? So firstly, business receives a minor portion of the charity's resources. There's no magic number here. But the idea is, again, if 10% of your resources are going to the things that CRA recognizes as charitable, and then 90% are going to the market rate stuff, that's not subordinate. That you seem to be mainly a business with some charity on the side. But if you've got your, let's say you're 80% charity and you've got maybe 20%, then we're closer to the subordinate area. 10% probably a comfortable number. These are really contextual determinations. So I'm just throwing out these numbers as general guides. It really does matter the context and the situation, and your ability to tell a story explaining the particular number and extent of resources you are dedicating to that business. So for example, at the startup stage, it might make more sense to dedicate more resources with the plan that over time it's going to decline, for example. But you need to be able to explain that and point to documents explaining that. Number two, the business is integrated into operations rather than a self-contained unit. The more that the market rate work that you are doing seems to be its own thing, running on its own rationale and its own kind of logic, receiving its own budget, the less it's going to look subordinate to the overall programming. So I think in some ways this is actually good news for a land trust that may want to treat its operations in a more holistic way, in a more integrated way. The law actually wants it to be integrated and more holistic. So this is perhaps a guard against mission drift. C, the charitable goals continue to dominate the charity's decision making. So a land trust may have many objectives, right? And some of them may be charitable, some of them may not be charitable. And at any given time in, let's say, a members meeting or a board meeting and so on, things are going back and forth, and it may not be clear which of those purposes predominate, which of those take priority over others. So one of the ways that charity law may step in and start to constrain you or lead to mission drift and so on is its insistence that those purposes which count as charitable at law predominate. You need to be able to point to minutes of meetings. You need to be able to point to, let's say, memorandums of understanding or contracts and so on that you're engaging with your partners and so on, and say, look, we can see clearly this decision is justified by the charitable purpose and not some of those other purposes. So some of your stakeholders may view the subordination of other purposes as being mission drift. So that's something to be mindful of. And then finally, I should note, though, the flip side of this is also a way to guard against negative mission drift, where the business considerations start to predominate over some of your public benefit mission considerations. So it's a double-edged sword. And then finally, D, no element of private benefit enters the charity's operations. So this is a situation I wouldn't be surprised if people on the call have faced. Somebody wants to donate land. Maybe they're a commercial landlord, maybe they're a private individual, but they want to retain some kind of interest in the land, or they want you to promote the fact that they've made this donation and so on. So these are ways that private benefit may enter into consideration of a land trust, and the charity needs to be careful about ensuring that any private benefit that is flowing to an individual is either justified in terms of we're providing a charitable benefit to that individual, or it's justified in terms of a benefit that the charity is getting in exchange. So you can engage in market relationships, but you need to be able to justify those relationships in terms of the benefit that's flowing back to the charity. The element of private benefit entering the charity's operations, this is another example of where you might experience tension between the mutual benefit philosophy out of which the land trust model emerges, and the kind of the idea of altruism and of the charity model. So this is another opportunity for tension. One thing I'm just going to note about all of what I've just described, the related business is a unique concept in the Income Tax Act, and what I've just described is CRA's policy position as it's currently articulated in the current version of the guidance. This is subject to change as the CRA changes its mind on various things. This is not law in the sense that it's binding legislation or case law. This is a policy position. So there is room for negotiation. There is room for case-by-case analysis, and keep your eye on this because the guidance may change in the years to come. Next slide. So I think the last thing I'm going to talk about are investment powers. So another power that a charity has that isn't in and of itself charitable is investing. And just think of all the foundations out there that spend, maybe 95% of their time actually managing investments. And that would seem to be like the opposite of charity, is just, playing the stock market. Nevertheless, they're charitable entities and they spend a great deal of time managing investment portfolios. So this is a power that charities have because basically all legal persons have this ability, if they have property, to invest that property. But there are a few rules that distinguish how registered charities are allowed to do it versus how other organizations or individuals can do it. So a registered charity can have investments like holding shares in a for-profit company, and that for-profit company could develop or manage real estate and could do it at a market rate. So this is another example. We've heard about structures where you have a nonprofit and a charity. There are also structures where you have a nonprofit and a charity and also a business that operates a slice of the market rate housing. So that's one way that a charity can run housing in a way that subsidizes the below market rate housing. Secondly, it can invest in it can own buildings that it only passively manages through bare bones maintenance. And those buildings can then be leased out to businesses or to individuals at a market rate. So this would be an example where as the charity as a landlord would enter into a lease agreement. I forget what they're called, the triple net lease agreement, where you basically make the tenant responsible for everything within that building. So you're doing the absolute minimum as a landlord. So that's fine because that's already a passive investment. The risk is that you move from being a passive landlord to something where you're actively engaged, and that moves from passive investment to being engaged in a business that may not be a related business. So that's the risk. And since these boundaries are artificial and there may be turnover within your organization or there may be volunteers, that is really the risk of keeping all these artificial distinctions straight in your minds. A third way a charity can engage in investment is through a limited partnership interest in a real estate project, and it needs to be a limited partnership because if it's not limited partnership, the difference between a general partnership and a limited partnership is the limited partner does not engage in the business. As soon as you overstep that bounds, you're not a limited partner, but you're a general partner. That's considered operating a business, and for you to do that, you need to be able to justify it as a related business. So registered charities can also make program-related investments, and this includes loans, loan guarantees, leases of lands or buildings, or share purposes. So, for example, you could make a loan to a for-profit landlord in exchange for a certain number of units within that building being below market rate or being affordable. So this might be an option if you're not in a position where you can actually afford to buy the land outright, but you're trying to increase the number of units you can offer. If you can qualify something as a program-related investment under the guidance linked at the bottom, community economic development, you don't actually have to justify your investment decision in terms of a return on capital. But if you are justifying what you are doing in terms of this is an investment we are making, then your board as a fiduciary needs to be able to justify its investments in terms of the return. And the laws on this will vary from province to province according to trust law. So in Ontario, for example, you're allowed to take into account whether an investment is mission aligned, and you can get a lower return if it's mission aligned. But in other provinces, that may not be the case, and so you may need to expect a market rate return in order to justify something as an investment. Next slide. So that brings me to the end of my slides. So back to you, Celia.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we'll have time at the end for any questions on all of that as well. So just before we get into the questions, the last thing that we wanted to cover is kind of alternative approaches to this whole question of CLTs and charitable status. So other kind of things you might want to keep in mind, or other, ways you could go about your organizational structure. So first, there are ways for non-charity nonprofits, also called non-qualified donees or NQDs, to partner with charities. We need to be very careful with our language here. The CRA does not allow non-charities to kind of borrow charitable status, although that's language that's sometimes used. Instead, charities can partner with NQDs, non-qualified donees, in ways that enable those NQDs to do work that falls within the charity's charitable purposes. But anything that involves the transfer of resources from a charity to an NQD is very regulated and needs to be done carefully. So ways of partnering with a charity as a non-charity could be partnering with them to apply for a particular grant. The charity would kind of act as the trustee. They would be the main applicant and effectively the project leader. This sort of partnership might be very helpful in the early stages of a CLT's life, like when they're applying for grants to support their capacity building, when they're still trying to kind of get off the ground. Having a well-aligned charity as a trustee, as an organization that that you have a good relationship with, might mean that your CLT doesn't see the need to apply for charitable status. And sometimes this is the case when a CLT is originally incubated by a nonprofit that has charitable status. They have that ongoing relationship with the charity. If you're doing something like this, it's important that you establish a clear agreement to guide your partnership. And it's also important that you carefully account for the use of funds. This is really largely kind of the charity's responsibility, but it'll be important to your continued partnership to be really careful about only using funds that you receive from the charity for the agreed upon purposes. It's also important, you'll find that it's important that your values align, at least to an extent, at least on the activities that you're doing, with the values of the charity you're partnering with. Now, a couple years ago, the CRA made an update. There was an update to the Income Tax Act, and the CRA recently released a new guidance on this update. So it's about charities and non-qualified donees. Basically, this change provides a bit of an alternative to the previous way that charities had to work with non-qualified donees, which was they had to exercise direction and control over the NQDs. Now, the charity doesn't need to be as closely involved in the NQD's work, but they do need to still ensure that any resources that they grant to the NQD are only used for charitable activities, and not just for any charitable activities, but for the charity's own charitable activities and purposes. Kind of related to this, some CLTs have been working on partnerships with local charities that will enable the charity to make regular grants to the CLT and work with them in a kind of ongoing way. So do stay tuned for information on this. We'll definitely share information on any successful arrangements that are made under this. And it might take a bit of time for some foundations and other charities to get used to these new these updates to the Income Tax Act. Charities do tend to be quite kind of risk averse, so it might take time to see things really changing in this area. Now, finishing with some more intangible thoughts and approaches. The question of charitable status can be quite controversial kind of among CLT practitioners. I don't, and kind of the network doesn't want to be prescriptive in terms of the approach that your CLT should take. But it's important to make the decision with a full understanding of the potential ways that having charitable status might conflict or provide challenges to your CLT's values or principles or goals. And I want to give a shout out to Dominique Russell, who's been on the board of the Kensington Market CLT for a while, and who really helped me think through some of these kind of issues and kind of tricky questions. So first, and Benjamin kind of alluded to this earlier, but you might find that there's a conflict between the usual sort of grassroots community organizing approach taken by many CLTs and the kind of professionalization or hierarchy that you may find is necessary when operating a charity. So this could lead in some cases to decreased community participation or a decreased sense of community ownership over the CLT. it might lead to decreased ability for the CLT residents to participate in governance, because with charities, it's very important to avoid any real or perceived conflict of interest. And there might be kind of further barriers to entry for CLT residents or community members who want to participate in the board, because there are more kind of complicated legalistic decisions and activities that they'll need to undertake. Relatedly, of course, as I mentioned before, the CRA has strict but also kind of vague guidelines on political advocacy, political activity. And so it doesn't mean if you're a charity that you absolutely cannot do any advocacy, but you do need to be careful. And the kind of gray areas that are involved here often mean that charities do become quite risk averse when it comes to how they approach these issues. So, you can still, as a charity, talk to government officials about the need for affordable housing. But you might need to be really careful if you're talking to, specifically officials with the Liberal Party about their policy platform. But it can be a bit ambiguous and easy to cross the line. So, if you're a charity, you might make the decision to be a bit more conservative in your approach to advocacy and policy discussions. One thing about this that's kind of tricky to navigate is that it could put your CLT at odds with tenant organizers or other kind of key local supporters in your community who could want or expect your solidarity with their, advocacy. And you might find that their support is essential to keep your CLT going and to keep the CLT in line with the community's priorities. There's kind of a catch-22 because some CLTs might find that they need to engage in a lot of advocacy in order to get the funding programs that they need to do their work, right, to fund their work. But if your work group is also overly worried about, being on the wrong side of the CRA, you might then want to back out of this advocacy and therefore, leave the onus on other CLTs to do it. But then again, you might feel the need to, have charitable status, be a charity, to secure the funding that you need in the absence of sufficient government support for your work, to secure private donations. So that's kind of a tricky, how do you balance those two things? So I'm not saying one approach is better than the other. It's just something that you'll need to think through as a group, and think of it with reference to your particular kind of financial circumstances, your group's values, and all of those kind of key considerations. And again, Ben, I think, said this really well earlier, but being a charity does involve kind of a different way of thinking about the people who benefit from your organization's work. So it could lead to a shift from thinking of people who live on the CLT's land as kind of neighbors or community members to thinking of them as beneficiaries or clients. The kind of relief of poverty requirement really kind of can change the relationship between the CLT and the people that it serves, who are, traditionally kind of an important part of the CLT and its governance. This kind of further removes a CLT from an ethos of mutual aid where we're helping each other, but instead it's sort of a more kind of top-down, we're helping others. And the kind of final point on this, some might feel that having charitable status involves a kind of closer relationship with the colonial system. So it means that being a charity means that your work is kind of more closely dictated and restricted by the settler colonial state, right? And many CLTs want to take a decolonial approach to their work and to their relationship with land. So this is kind of another kind of point of conflict or something that they might need to kind of come to terms with. So many people take issue kind of with the charity sector from an ideological perspective, but also a lot of those same objections can be levied against non-charity nonprofits, having to work kind of within the system. So it's sort of a matter of, intensity of conflicts and where your organization decides to kind of draw the line. But, nonprofits can be a bit more sort of autonomous or independent compared to charities. So a lot of kind of big questions, discussions that have been happening among CLT practitioners that people have strong feelings about on both sides. we don't really have any precise answers on these. But the best way to kind of walk this line and to respond to these conflicts will be something that's unique to your group and to your community and the realities that you're facing. So that's a very kind of cheerful note to end on. And I'd love to also hear your thoughts and get into this discussion either today or another time, because it's something it's really a live issue, I think, for a lot of groups to kind of come to terms with. But I just wanted to also draw your attention before we open to questions to some further resources that are linked in these slides that you can click through. We also have upcoming events. The CLT Summit, if you were at our last member meeting, we've announced that it will almost definitely be October 18th to 20th and in Vancouver, but we are still confirming some things, but save the date. And I want to thank everybody who helped inform these materials. I spoke to a number of people with different CLTs to kind of inform all of this, and they were very, very helpful and generous with their time and expertise. An absolutely massive thank you to you, Ben, for contributing all of this information and for joining me today. So now we turn to all of you. We have a decent amount of time for questions, so feel free to either throw things in the chat or raise your hand or just speak up. And I will stop recording as well. Yeah, go ahead, Christopher.